Many Americans may associate Vietnamese people with those faceless extras found in Vietnam War movies. Even when these portrayals are sympathetic, Vietnamese people remain stereotyped as foreign, alien, passive, and remote. We are rarely pictured as your neighbors, your coworkers, your classmates, or your friends. My name is Pham. I'm a first-generation Vietnamese American artist, and I want to share the history of the Vietnamese diaspora in the United States through my family's history. The misconception that the Vietnam War was America versus Vietnam obscures many things, including the fact that the US and South Vietnam were allies during the war, fighting against North Vietnam. Also, the us versus them narrative obscures the fact that many Vietnamese are now Americans. As of 2018, there are over 2.1 million Vietnamese Americans, and they are the fourth largest group of Asian Americans, just behind Chinese, Indians, and Filipinos. Who are Vietnamese Americans, and how did we get here? As many Vietnamese Americans say, we are here because you were there. Most Vietnamese Americans like my family arrived here as refugees rather than immigrants because of the Vietnam War. My mother's family was one of many that left Vietnam on April 30th, 1975. On this day, Vietnam was reunified under North Vietnam's socialist government, known as the Liberation of Saigon in Vietnam, the Fall of Saigon to Americans, or the Black Day to many Vietnamese Americans. When the radio announced that Saigon had been captured by the North, some of my great-grandmother's neighbors celebrated, but she was struck with fear. Before 1975, the Vietnamese population in the U.S. numbered only around 15,000, yet in 1975 alone, over 130,000 Vietnamese came as refugees in what has come to be called the First Wave. Many of this first wave of Vietnamese American refugees had worked for the South Vietnamese or the U.S. government. They were often urban, Catholic, middle or upper class, formally educated, and knew some English. Many were evacuated from Vietnam by the U.S. military and were processed at U.S. military bases before being permanently resettled. They included high-ranking officials such as former South Vietnamese Prime Minister Nguyen Cao Ky, who fled Vietnam aboard the USS Blue Ridge, settled in Westminster in Southern California, and ran a liquor store. But they also included ordinary infantrymen and bureaucrats, translators, secretaries, and employees of U.S.-owned businesses. The bulk of Vietnamese refugees came to the U.S. after 1977. They were the second wave, and were often called boat people because many traveled by sea to neighboring countries like Malaysia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, and Hong Kong. My family was one of these boat people. Compared with the first wave, second wave refugees often came from rural areas, were less formally educated, and had less English proficiency. Many second wave refugees fled by clandestine and impromptu means. My Bawai arranged to fly her entire family out of Saigon, but missed the last flight while waiting on her sisters, who were trapped across town. When Saigon was seized, my family ran all the way to Vung Tau, 60 miles away, to catch the last boat. My mom, who was 8 years old then, recalls running by foot while the Viet Cong shot at them. Along with Vietnamese, the second wave also included Cambodians who fled the genocide of over 2 million Khmer people by the Khmer Rouge, and Hmong from Laos, who had assisted the U.S. in secret during the Vietnam War and were now being persecuted. Boat people's journeys were fraught with danger. My great-grandmother negotiated for passage aboard the ship Trung Xuan and almost lost her baby and her life in the frenzy. My family ran out of water and drifted for days because the boat's engine broke down, while sharks and small boats circled us. Paranoia ran high as people accused others of being communist and rationed drinking water, causing deaths and riots. After the days adrift, the Trung Xuan was sighted and rescued by a Denmark cargo ship. We were lucky, as many others fell victim to pirates, were lost at sea or capsized, or succumbed to disease or starvation before finding refuge. The number of second-wave refugees jumped after 1977, soon reaching several thousand a month, quickly overwhelming neighboring countries and making for an international refugee crisis. In 1979, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees convened the Geneva Conference to organize and resettle refugees in over a dozen countries outside of Southeast Asia. Many families waited in refugee camps to be resettled. My family was brought to Hong Kong's Dodwell Ridge, where they would stand in a food line every day, supplemented by soup or can made from wild herbs. My Bawai traded things to make petty cash for emergencies. We were among the 823,000 Southeast Asian refugees the U.S. took in between 1975 to 1995, with Australia, Canada, and France accepting the next largest numbers. 63% of these refugees were Vietnamese. 17% were Cambodian, and 20% were from Laos. Although a majority of the American public did not approve of accepting so many Southeast Asians, the US government saw its refugee policy as a continuation of the Vietnam War. It created a narrative that the US was the gracious host rescuing people fleeing from communism. What was life like in the US for Vietnamese refugees? While the US provided us permanent asylum, we had little assistance as refugees. After being sponsored by a Presbyterian church, my Buddhist grandmother moved into a housing project and worked for little pay, making extra money by sewing clothes. Some refugees were also sponsored by religious organizations, some by American families, while others relied on public assistance. Southeast Asian refugees were spread throughout the country, including my family, who was placed in Maryland. However, this placement only isolated us from the pre-existing immigrant and Vietnamese communities, prompting my family's subsequent remigration to New Jersey, then Texas. Almost half of Southeast Asian refugees eventually left the communities where they were originally resettled to move to another state. Even though we are often lumped together with Asian American immigrants, Southeast Asian refugees like my family differ because we are forced to leave our country due to violence, persecution, or war, while immigrants migrate to seek out economic or social opportunities. Because of these circumstances, trauma and displacement add to the difficulties in adjusting to life here, despite our resilience. Southeast Asians who experience the Vietnam War often suffer from PTSD, but they receive none of the support or sympathy given to American veterans. Even those without PTSD have suffered the loss of loved ones, careers, family homes, and communities. Other Southeast Asians mourn the loss of a homeland. Many Vietnamese refugees refuse to acknowledge the existence of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, continuing to fly the flag of the bygone Republic of Vietnam, aka South Vietnam, in little Saigons across the country. Second-wave refugees often have fewer privileges and resources to draw upon than first-wavers. My Bawai had a 5th-grade education and only spoke Vietnamese, but converted her home into a tailor shop, a restaurant, and pool hall, and opened tailor stores for my aunts so they could support their families. Juvenile crime in Southeast Asian American communities has led to a recent crisis of deportations, as Southeast Asian American adults with a criminal record are now being deported back to countries they never knew. As a result of these differences, Southeast Asian Americans often experience higher rates of poverty, incarceration, and unemployment, and lower levels of educational attainment and financial security than other Asian Americans. The model minority stereotype of Asian Americans hides these disparities, lumping refugees together with more prosperous immigrant communities. My family is grateful for the opportunities the U.S. has given us and has remained resilient along with other Vietnamese, Khmer, Hmong, and Lao Americans. However, we must remember the reasons why we came here and the many ways that immigration law and international refugee policy paved the way for our arrival. If we are to honor the perilous journeys that Southeast Asian refugees took, we must also acknowledge the struggles we faced after we arrived here, and also help to welcome other refugee and migrant groups who came before and continue to come after us.